Today we're going to have a look at a specific industry and one that we've seen a lot of financial difficulty starting to develop. It's the motel industry, and more specifically country motels. Now, going back in time, a motel generally in a small country town was a focal point. It had a restaurant. That restaurant was generally fairly busy, and it was somewhere where there was always a crowd. So during the week, it would be guaranteed to have a full restaurant at least 4 to 5 nights a week. On the weekends, it had a fairly open bar, and it was an alternative to pubs. Now, as time has progressed and restaurants have become more prevalent, the food and beverage offering for a lot of motels disappeared. So they became standalone accommodation operations. Now, what we saw, and certainly in the experience that we had, was in a group of motels, and we'll say it was 100, only 2 or 3 were actually making money off their food offering. But they still had a fully commercial kitchen, they still had a full-time chef, and they were still offering meals. And we looked at this and said, well, why? And you go back and you look at the history, and a lot of this had to do with their leases, where they were forced to keep operating. So their lease said they must run a restaurant, they must run a restaurant for breakfast and for dinner. They also had to run a bar. Now, in some of these places we had a look at, the beers hadn't been drunk for 2 or 3 years, where they didn't have an offering anymore that was related to their customers. Now, looking at the motel industry in particular, this is one industry that has really suffered, and it's had a lot of pressures put upon it. It's a bit like the taxi industry in that Airbnb has come along, and so has stays. So on one hand, we've got new accommodation alternatives, even to the extent now you can go into a town with 500 people and there'll be Airbnb offerings. Now, 5 or 10 years ago, there was only one motel. So if there was something on, it could run at 100% occupancy without much difficulty. But now it has competition. So all of a sudden, these little country motels are under a lot more pressure. The next issue we had a look at, and it's something that is quite prevalent these days, is there aren't as many travellers anymore. So 15 years ago, if you wanted to buy items wholesale, you really had to wait until a traveller came along. So if there were new products, they would be doing a lap. So in northern New South Wales, they would start in Sydney, go along the coast road, go up to Brisbane, then come back via the New England. But as the internet became more normalised and ordering became done over the internet, all of a sudden the traveller market disappeared. And for some of the motels we were looking at, they were having a drop-off of 90 to 95% of their old traditional business travellers because they weren't doing the lap anymore. The next issue was one that we've seen a lot of, and that's where the accommodation providers are required to use Booking.com or Trivago or any of the accommodation providers, and they're charging a surcharge. So for a motel operator, their margins are already fairly small, and for a good operator, they're running somewhere between 23 and 34%. But the accommodation wholesalers are charging anywhere from 11 to 15%, so their margins are becoming a lot thinner. So for a small business where you've now got to pay upwards of 10 or 15% of your revenue out to a third-party supplier, really for the same customers you would have had anyway, this becomes quite difficult. And what we've seen is a lot of accommodation providers just simply can't survive if they've got to pay third-party suppliers. What we saw a lot of and what we experienced was there's a lot of oversupply and there's a lot of under-quality. In a lot of small towns, there were big motels built. And we use a little town called Capella as a really good example where there's a population, a permanent population of 1,000 people, but there's a 70-room motel. Now that motel will never have 100% occupancy. Now amusingly, there's also another 3 motels in the town. And you look at this and you say, well, yes, there were good times, but all of a sudden there's now oversupply. And another example of this is a town like Armidale that has 30 accommodation options with a population of 22,000 people. Yes, at times they run at 100%, but in normal times they go nowhere near 100%. And the motels are fighting between themselves, and the only option is down. The next issue we've seen a lot of is that the quality is rather poor. So recently we looked after a portfolio of motels. The average age of these motels was 40 years old. They hadn't kept up with the times. Some of them were so dilapidated and so old that they weren't worth paying the prices that they were expecting. And when we go through a little bit further about leases, these motel operators were overpaying for what they were offering. So in the motel industry in particular, there hasn't been a rejuvenation, and the reason for that is there hasn't really been the investment, the capital investment that's required. If things have been built, they've been built for a very specific purpose, but for the most part, a lot of these older motels have just chugged along as normal. They haven't improved, they haven't made themselves anything special, and they're wondering why their prices are not going up. The next issue we've seen a lot of is the rise of the caravan. Now in Queensland alone, there's 170,000 registered caravans. And if you think about this, that's nights of accommodation that are no longer available to motel operators. But during that time, the number of motels has also increased by 25%. So what you're seeing is you're seeing an industry which is now competing on multiple platforms, but has increased its own capacity and hasn't taken advantage. So all of a sudden, we have old dilapidated rooms competing with a caravan or a camper trailer or a Winnebago. So all of a sudden, they can't compete. The next issue that really impacted motels, and this is something we noticed, was that they're industry specific. They have very limited zoning and they have very limited other use. A motel is a very difficult building to adapt. So what we've found is that the only option for a lot of these owners is to knock them down, and they're reticent to do so. So while ever they have a tenant in place, they won't do anything to improve the building because it can only ever be used as a motel. So what they really have is an accommodation opportunity until such time as the tenant goes broke, and then they'll bulldoze. And so what we've seen is a lot of motels are looking older and older and older because there's no benefit for the landlord in putting any money into it. They're just waiting to a point in the future where they don't have a tenant and they put a bulldozer through the front door. This is an issue which is rather close to our heart, and we've worked on both sides, so for landlords but also for tenants. But the problem we've seen that as rents are increasing, room rates are not. And I always give the indication, and I see this as the best example. If you look at the standby rates at the front of a motel, have a look at the sign. And you'll see a lot of the signs have actually got rust on them. Now, for a sign like that to get rust on it takes anywhere from 10 to 15 years. That shows you how long it's been since the prices have increased. So meanwhile, the rent that's being paid to the landlord has increased over that 15-year period of time by upwards of 50 to 75%. But the room rate hasn't, and the occupancy hasn't. So what's happened is our tenant can't afford to continue to operate. And when we dealt with a large landlord, he actually had a period of time where he knew most of his tenants would fall to a point of insolvency. Now, unfortunately, the nature of the industry as it is, the leases are very much in favour of the landlord and not the tenant. So what we find is there's a lot of uncommercial transactions, and where we have a tenant in situ in a motel, trying to get them out is often the best approach. So could we say this is the beginning of the end of the motel industry in the way it is? Certainly for small country towns, it's becoming harder and harder for people to make money. And what we're seeing is tenants are suffering more and tenants are falling over. For landlords, if they're not being realistic, they're having vacant premises. And the problem is finding staff to go into these premises if a tenant falls over is not easy. So in our view, there's certainly a beginning of the end where the small country town accommodation is going to reduce unless it can be rejuvenated or it becomes a destination. And unfortunately, a lot of these landlords are stuck in a view that I won't spend money on this property because at some point in the future, it'll just be a vacant block. So if you're looking for some guidance, especially if you're a tenant in a motel, or you're looking for some help on the hospitality front, feel free to give us a call. Our number is 1300 023 782, or visit our website. We've done a couple of research papers on the motel industry in particular, and what we see is happening in the future.